Okay, I think we might be live. Brian, Noah, how are you?
Oh,
How are you?
Great. Cool. Well, I mean, this is obviously the live stream AMA of Divinity and Board. As you can see from the last update, we had quite a few changes that we've been making to try and basically bring it to its final stages of development. Uh, that update was never going to cover everything, so we're hoping that this AMA will definitely certainly help with that. Although whether that covers everything and we're going to have to do more afterwards, I would not be surprised. But we're obviously going to be best to inform as best as possible. So yeah, just thank you obviously for tuning in. Hopefully we'll answer those questions and everyone's queries or concerns will be. Um, Brian, know anything specific you want to say before we dive into the massive amount of questions we've got from our comment section and also from chat?
nothing specific at the moment. I will have plenty to say when we handle the questions, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear from sort of the audience and figure out the things that they want to know.
Cool. Well, let me just I need to position the questions, but I also need to position chat so I can actually see what everything is going on here. All right, cool. So in that case, yeah, let's dive in. I think the first thing we can probably deal with is that one of the main questions was, can we expect to see an updated rulebook and or a gameplay video before the pledge manager closes? From the update, we said that the pledge manager will be closing basically when testing is done later on this year. We'll similar to what we were communicating before, we will give you warning on the pledge manager closing, so we'll probably have a month or so of notice before we say, hey, we're going to be closing the pledge manager and going to print. Um, Definitely before that, we're going to have our first draft rulebook ready to share. The rulebook is currently being developed. The reasons why that's not actually ready is important because the graphic designer that works on that is also the graphic designer that works on our Atlas. So she's juggling between the two. So we want to get the Atlas ready for testing. And that's kind of the major push pull that we're got there. But once the rulebook is ready, we'll be sharing it with you. Likewise, we'll be doing a gameplay video sometime during the testing phase over the next couple of months. We'll do like a lengthy 2 hour long video where people are playing and you get to see how in shorter form before that happens. We have actually currently in production, we're working on a tutorial video which will kind of give you the basics of how to play and won't cover everything, but it'll give you a much more kind of robust idea of how to dive in and play as opposed to just us talking about the general mechanics of the game. But
Yeah, and
go on.
sorry, and I think it's important to say that, like, we've had the general structure of the rulebook down for a little bit now, and we're testing it to make sure that it's readable and understandable, figuring out where we need examples and things like that. Because writing rule books is hard. um, but we're sort of making sure that we're doing our due diligence there.
Yeah, it's not that like we haven't got the rules in point. It's more that while we've been testing, the rules have obviously been in doc form to be malleable and usable. The moment we start putting it into InDesign and actually designing out a properly visually designed rule book with examples and everything, it starts to waste designer time and also graphic. So we want to maximize time for sure. Cool. Well, so it's not the first few questions where I'm just talking. We're going to skip ahead a little bit. And we'll talk about one or two of the other major changes that had some questions for you guys. Speaking of the rulebook, Noah, one of the questions was, are the game rules for the rulebook and the Divine Atlas two physically separate things? Will players have to memorize rules within the rulebook or in the Atlas? Um, like, how is that going to work? Because I know that we had said we'll be putting key rules in the Atlas so that you don't need to learn them as you go. But you want to explain a little bit how we're designing our rulebook so that all the information is
Yes.
there for sure.
The way that I want you to think of the rule summaries that show up in the atlas is more like tooltips. They are not a they're not the only place where that rule is going to show up. It's not like every time difficult terrain shows up, we put it in the atlas and we don't touch it in the rules at all. The way that it's going to work is that there's going to be two segments to the rule book. There is the rules, which is generally how to play, and it's going to immediately segue into a much longer section that is the glossary. So we'll mention that statuses exist in the rules and how you tick them down each turn, or area conditions and generally what they do. But then all of the specifics we're going to be going over in the glossary itself. And what the way that interfaces with the Divine Atlas is that the first time that you encounter oily terrain or difficult terrain, it's going to tell you what that does right on the page in the Divine Atlas, and then also point you to the entry in the glossary. And then in future locations, when you probably have that down, we're going to say, hey, there's difficult terrain. It shows up here if you need a more in-depth um, rule set for it. It'll point you to the spot in the glossary, but you're not going to need to flip through the Divine Atlas to find the rules, or otherwise go through there as a rules reference. It is specifically to help you, not to cause you to have to flip through previous pages or anything like that. So it's there as an added guide because we have the real estate in the book, really.
Yeah, and I guess from the perspective of the new player joining in and wanting to start it from the very beginning of their journey, the goal here is not to divide the rules into various places in the book, or sorry, divide the rules in various places in the box, right? It's actually just simply to have, this is all you need to start. And once you get into it and you've got a rhythm, we start introducing some extra rules that will add some interesting complexity. And then if you need to, you can always go into the glossary, right? The intention is actually to allow your onboarding experience to be much smoother.
Exactly. We don't want you to have to memorize all the nuances of all the different things that could come up in combat before they actually start coming up. Because that way you can just start playing faster.
Cool. All right then. Great. Then I guess in that case, Brian, one of the questions actually is, are there any major changes made to the story, and are there any new writers on the team?
Yeah. So as far as the story goes, we are making some pretty significant changes to the way that you go through the story. The way that you encounter and get new information and things like that, it has changed a little bit, and I'm sure that we'll get to that a little bit later when we start talking about the journal. But we did bring on a person that Noah and I have worked with before, named Kat, an amazing writer who worked with us on Betrayal, and has worked on Dungeons and Dragons and a number of other sort of big projects. Who's really done some amazing work in knitting our ideas together into something that's really cohesive. She's incredibly good at that. And she has had she spent a lot of time with the source material, with Divinity and with these characters, and I think done a really good job of sort of bringing the world to life in a way that's true to the Divinity video games, while also really understanding what it is that makes a board game story tick.
Yeah.
That's a thing that I think that she excels at incredibly well. And it's one of the reasons why we love working with her, is because she's very, very good at saying, like, oh, these are the things you need, and you don't need this stuff. And so, like, both as a content creator and an editor, she's been incredibly, incredibly helpful to us sort of moving forward.
I've often had quite fun conversations with Kat where it's like, yeah, Kat, we need to explain all of this, but you only have a paragraph to do so because it's on a card or whatever. And it's such an interesting, I guess, unique challenge for a writer to have not just it's not that we have less space. It's actually more about the attention span, right? It's about how do we get the key information across that's story relevant, that matters to the narrative that the players want to experience, while also keeping them engaged in the gameplay. And some players might just want to dive into the next fight or whatever. So it's always that kind of push-pull balance of too much information or not enough information. Add that to the multiple paths that we can go on and the multiple ways that you can learn information. We also then need to wrap up that narrative in a way that people understand at the end, which quite frankly is a unique challenge in the Divinity video game as well, that I think absolutely Kat has just jumped in with 2 feet and she's excelling in.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we are always aware of as board game designers is, flavor text is important for um, making sure that the place makes sense and it feels like we're in a location. But fundamentally, we're making a game that you have to play. And you know, Kat and myself, and Kieran, you as well, and Noah, we're all gamers. We all do play a lot of board games, and so like it's useful to have someone who has that writing talent in the room who also knows the feeling of board games and like knows how to construct those things and sort of works with us. So when she says what happens in this location, we can say, oh, XYZ, there's magisters here, they might catch you. She can really sort of fold that bit of tension into a location in a way that makes it really interesting.
It also means that she has a really good handle on getting the mechanics to be represented in the text.
Yeah.
In a way that makes it so that you read this description, and then when the fight with the Magister starts, you're not blindsided by it, feel like it's a satisfying, oh yeah, because we did the thing, and now the Magisters have, cornered us because we did this wrong turn. Clearly they were already on our tail, so I'm not surprised that suddenly a fight started, which is an important thing to be able to do in relatively small amount of text, and she's very good at it.
Yeah, and I totally want to bounce off what Brian just said as well. Finding the talent is one thing, but finding someone who's experienced in working within this medium specifically, because even just finding the right graphic designers for this project was also a challenge. Because obviously we started with you guys and with this new reimagining, but we've added to the team, and you really want people who can tackle on and understand some of the challenges of the physical medium as much as just the mechanics or the physical or the numbers behind the sheets, so to speak. But yeah, look, let's keep diving in because we have a lot of questions, and I don't want to. And also, chat is pinging away, so I definitely want to be answering chat as well. So, I will just dive into one or two of the other kind of housekeeping ones that people are asking about. The testing printing time frame seems a bit tight. Are they final? Is one of the questions here. I will be 100% upfront with this. The testing at the moment is based on us doing the full-time testing, as we said. So we're adding a bunch of people to our team to do this basically robust testing. What that will allow us to do is essentially pull out an iteration of balance and changes and tweaks every 2 to 3 weeks. Which, if you followed all of our updates over the last few years, when we've done testing with volunteers, it's usually every 2 to 3 months that an iteration would happen as a result. So we are basically, because we're going full time as a result of that, we're able to speed up that process. The other thing I would say about that, though, is that we're much more confident with the opening feeling for players, where we were always struggling with that in the previous iteration. Now, before we even announce this new change and this update, we are so much happier with the opening couple of hours of experience in terms of balance and feel and education of the rules that we're quite confident with the timeline that we have set forth. We will never say 100% this is it. As you can probably tell, that question also mentions printing and timeframes for delivery and whatever else. While we know what the world is like now, I have no idea what the world would be like in November or in October when we're talking about going to print again and then shipping after that. At the moment, there are timelines, but they can obviously change. And as they change, if they do, we'll make sure to keep you informed on those changes. Cool. That's one for me. So let's tackle. Well, you mentioned actually, Brian. We can talk about the journal cards. So one of the questions was, is the Chronicle system still part of the game? And I think in a large part, the heart of what it was trying to achieve is still there, but we've obviously evolved it, and in my opinion, we've actually added to it. So do you want to explain a little bit about the journal system and how that works?
Yeah, so we talked about it a little bit in the update whenever we talked about the game having memory and the game remembering some of your choices. The journal events are how we mechanically make that thing happen. So depending on the choices that you make or the paths that you take or the people that you talk to, you will get physical components, journal cards, that will sort of remind you of your story over the course of the island, or over the course of your adventure. And we have a place where you can put those, and they sort of stay there until the game needs to know that you've done something. So, we have a location very early on, where you have to make a pretty decisive choice about whether to help one person or help another person. And depending on the choice that you make, you'll get a journal event from that, and they'll give you different information depending on who you help. Um, Kieran, do you want me to get a little bit more specific about this? I think you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, you can get a bit more specific for sure.
So, basically, as soon as you enter Fort Joy, you will be faced with a decision to either help a band of prisoners or help some elves.
A situation quite familiar if you've played the video game.
Right. And if you help the elves, you'll get one journal event, and if you help the prisoners, you'll get another one. And then later on down the line, the game actually reacts to that decision that you make, because it'll say, hey, do you have journal event 17? If you do, you get this different set of cards. If you do, these people react to you differently. And that's been relatively important for us sort of going through, to make sure that we have these journal events, and the journal events aren't just memory, they're your recollection of your story through the island. And so whenever we get through, whenever you get through playing the entire game, you'll have, or you might have, a totally different set of journal cards than another person because of the choices that you made. So, you might have more or less information about certain aspects of the story as other people. And it's big. There's a lot of that sort of content in the game.
Yeah, the journal events allow us that reactivity beyond the location, right? Because we have the holding area for cards that want to give reactivity. We are allowing placement of cards to change the map based on stuff that you might do for that reactivity. But in terms of reactivity beyond the one location you're currently playing in the Atlas, when you go into future locations, we lean on the journal event system to basically trigger those.
One of the things that I think is also not to be missed there is, in the previous system, the check marks that you would make are essentially flags, and whether or not you have certain flags is what happens. But in this system, they are flags with context. So when we ask if you have journal event 17, well, when you go and check, you can remind yourself what that actual event was and be like, yeah, because we helped the elves, this is part of that little storyline there, and you have context for what's happening. Or if something bad happens, you're like, yes, consequences, they exist.
Yes,
consequences. We like giving consequences, be them good or bad. All right, cool. So let's keep moving on. One of the other, so I'll deal with one of them real quickly. That will we get an updated components list with photos similar to what's on the campaign page under the what you get? Absolutely. Again, one of our so we have a team of graphic designers now, literally 3 of them. Matt, who's actually mostly responsible for our data merging and creating our test copies for testers, again, is focusing on the test copies for testers coming in August. But once he's freed up from that, he'll be creating our kind of 3D renders and the different kind of ways of displaying the game, so you can see actually what components you get. We'll give a component breakdown and everything. Of it. That was the good news about getting the white box, is that we're much closer to knowing exactly what the components will be, what room we have for either adding, or do we have to tweak something as a result of the white box itself. But at the moment, we're very close to that list, and once we have it, we'll be new pictures and new ideas down to what those components are. Cool. So part of the stretch goals that would have been one of the questions, again, someone's asking Noah, is there going to be a random dungeon generator still, given that we switched to a book? Obviously there's a question, do we even have this kind of random dungeon idea anymore?
Yeah, so it is still absolutely on our list of things that we want to make sure is in the game. It is not balanced to our satisfaction yet, so we're probably going to be able to offer a little more information about that in the future, in a future update, when we have it, where we really want it in terms of how it's performing. But yes, it is still on our. It has not been discarded. It is definitely still a thing that we are actively working on. So
Yeah, it's a major desire for us that if you don't want to necessarily jump into a full adventure, you can still kind of jump in and maybe experience one of the bosses you did encounter, this kind of thing.
Right.
Or some of the there are some units or sides of units that don't actually appear in the campaign, but will be available to experience in the randomly generated dungeons. So look forward to that, I guess, exploring those and finding all the enemies that you couldn't find in the campaign itself.
I think when that goes through to a point that we're actually much more confident in exactly how it plays out, we'll be able to probably talk about it in a future update over the coming months. Sweet. Then in that case, one of the things that we got another question for was the minis in the game. All the minis that were included in the campaign, are they going to still be in the box? Yes, we're going to still obviously include all the minis that we have there. Things like as well, like the cat and Sir Laura, are they in the game still? I guess Brian, we can speak to that a little bit. That the cat and Sir Laura are now these are still in the game. They're NPCs that you can interact with and obviously recruit as well, depending on choices, right?
Yep. Yeah, Sir Laura was, speaking of Cat, Sir Laura was one of the first things that we latched onto, and I think Cat and I had a conversation where we were like,
Yeah, you told me you would quit if we got rid of Sir Laura. Yes, you literally told me I'm out of this project. Yeah. The love for Sir Laura was very evident between you and Cat for sure.
Runs deep. But yeah, no, we found a way. We found a way to make all of that stuff work. And Sir Laura was sort of our test case for how we make NPCs work and how you get sort of allies to go with you during the course of your adventure. So those definitely still exist. They're important in the story. We've made sure of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we're pleased with the way that those came along.
I think as well, like it probably spins off. There's another question about what about the NPC deck. It kind of spins into that as well. Like I think so much of the content and the ideas that were in the original campaign are still there. We're just implementing them differently, right? So, for instance, the NPC deck, a lot of those NPCs are still in the game, but we don't have this separate mechanic, right?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that one of our goals when we sort of came on was to reduce the amount of time between learning a rule and using it, and to make sure that everything that the players needed was right in front of them. And so, in some ways, that meant getting rid of components or combining components with other components. But we were striving to keep as much of the content as we could still in the game, and I think that we've done a pretty good job of keeping a vast majority of the things that were in the game previously still appear in one way or another. It might not be a separate deck. For example, the NPCs might just appear in locations, and they'll look like location cards, but you'll get to interact with them that way. Or they might be summons, or things like that. So, we definitely know that these things are important, and we've been keeping an eye on them.
And I guess to riff off that to a certain degree, I think one of the challenges for you and Kat specifically is and refined it. I wouldn't say, if anything, the narrative hasn't been reduced too heavily, in my opinion. If anything, all the choices in the past are there. I think the complexity of getting the information across to you and understanding what path I'm on, what choices I have as the adventure unfolds, was one of the major things that you guys had to work on. And I feel like that was one of the things with the NPCs, was that very often, if we weren't careful, you meet an obscure NPC with no context of who they were or why they mattered, and that was one of the main kind of I will say challenges that you guys had to wrap up that narrative in a way that if I meet X NPC, I understand why, I understand what their context is, even if I haven't necessarily gone through the exact path we prefer you to go through necessarily.
Yep. Yeah. It's a challenge and a thing that we haven't necessarily talked about right now, and we're going to sort of get to it in another question. But I think whenever we're talking about the most extreme case, 2 players can play this game and only encounter 2 of the same location. There's a lot of branching that goes on, and so it's a challenge for us to sort of figure out how we're going to make sure that whenever you run into something, if you haven't taken the path that we intend you to take, if you sort of have meandered your way in one of the thousands of different paths you can take through the island, then everything still makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. And I think as we talk about the permutations of paths, we're going to talk about that later. You'll understand why that was a challenge for sure. I'm actually getting a ton of messages through chat, so much so that one of our moderators is telling me, which we'll just spin into it then. One of the questions has also been about the side quests and the side boxes specifically. Much like the dungeon, until we're necessarily locked in a little bit more, we're going to talk about them in a future update. But they are both still very much included in the game. We're still going to be doing them. One of the practical things is, how do we do an atlas for those? We're currently working with our manufacturers and with one of our graphic designers who's kind of handling the white boxing and everything else, to, instead of doing the book, to do premium boards. Because it's a limited amount of locations, we'll just do double-sided boards. That's kind of the idea we're looking with. We're going to experiment with that with the white box before we confirm. But very much so, we don't want that to feel like it's a thin book that doesn't feel very premium or content rich. We want to make sure that you still feel like the components are worthwhile in that box as well. But I guess, is there anything you want to hint at with the side quests? Because they're definitely going to add a little bit of extra, shall we say, spice to the game.
Yeah. So the 2 side quests are still there, and one of the things that we wanted to do is we wanted to treat them like expansions. So the stuff that you see in the side quests, you won't see anywhere else in the game, and
unless you bring it with you.
Unless you bring it with you. Let's leave it at that.
Yeah.
I feel like yeah, when when we were first talking about this game nearly over a year ago, and we were kind of explaining the depth and the size of this project, instead of you guys kind of shirking at side quests, extra work to convert and to do whatever, you guys really embraced it, and I've definitely, like I said, added a bit of extra spice and interesting flavor to each one. So I'm excited to see how those play and what people think of them when we start talking about them. Sure. But yeah, that's side quests. They are not abandoned at any stretch of the imagination. If anything, we have some ideas of how we can improve them, if anything else. Cool. Then let me skip ahead a bit, because I'm realizing that Noah is sitting comfortable there and hasn't said anything recently. Noah, one of the things that we mentioned in the update last week was it was kind of an offhanded question during our conversation where we said fights last about 2 to 3 turns. So someone actually has just recently asked, will boss fights take 2 to 3 turns, or will they be longer? Do you want to talk about boss fights, but also just elaborate a little bit about what our desire is with combat in general?
Yeah. So I'll arrive first about how we got to the 2 to 3 turns thing, and then how that branches out into combat as a whole for bosses. When you got into a fight, what we actually wanted was that this was a significant part of your experience at the location, but not the entire thing. So when you break it down to, you have a 4-player game, and each person's turn is going to take 2 to 3 minutes, and then you also have to process whatever the bad guys are doing. That's about 15 minutes for a round of combat. So when you take 2 or 3 turns of combat, that starts getting to around half an hour, 45 minutes worth of stuff, which seemed about right. And then the trick for us was making sure that the stuff that you're doing during your 2 to 3 minutes per round is engaging and rewarding and feels like you're actually making meaningful progress both as a team and individually. But a lot of it kind of backtracked from how long we actually wanted the fights to take from a real-time perspective. Now, when we get to a boss fight, obviously we're a little bit more comfortable with that fight taking longer, both narratively and in a literal sense. So those are actually balanced more for 4 to 5 rounds. And that allows you to have a little bit more time to interact with each boss's unique mechanics. It allows you enough time to, develop and execute on a strategy that takes maybe more than 1 or 2 turns to really come to fruition. Your skills can start coming off of cooldown, and you can start playing around with some longer term cooldowns there. And really, the boss fights are just meant to be a little bit more. But one of the other reasons why we made those fights as short as we did was the fights are meant to kind of showcase the skills that you're gaining in combat, and also feel like when you are delivering on a unique mechanic or synergy and comboing off, you're making significant progress. And if you invested in these 2 skills and rolled both of them together, played both of them the same turn, and even rolled well, and that resulted in you dealing 5% of the bad guy that you're attacking's health, that's not a high point that we want to be delivering. We would rather see, you have the synergy go off and you just chunked one of those bad guys for half of their health, and that feels like a much more satisfying high moment. And that corresponded again to about 2 to 3 turns in regular, and then give you a little bit more time to play around and show off during the boss fights, because they're also doing some interesting stuff that we want to have you experience as well. So the boss fights are going to take longer, both from a mechanic standpoint and a literal time on the clock standpoint.
Yeah, and actually, can I say something about that? What's
No.
Oh, fine.
Yes.
Okay. Well, we're shutting down the stream. I'm just stopping
Move it
it. Yeah. Well, thanks for that. You surprised me. Well, what I want to say about that though is, we've been testing this game for a while now. Just because we're talking about it, it's actually because we're now much more comfortable in saying this is the way it's going to play. Because we tested a lot of different, basically since November, since you guys gave us that vertical slice, and we were like, well, how does it play? We've been testing a lot on the feel of combat. Not just in terms of how many turns it takes, but how lethal it is for the enemy to attack the player, how lethal to attack the enemy, how much we reward combo play versus non-optimal combo play. And we even had some issues, Noah, you'll know, from balancing physical damage and physical combo with the combos you can do there, with magical combos, and et cetera, et cetera. There's been a bunch of challenges that we've been dealing with and we've been doing a lot of internal testing as a result of that. But it does feel like we've landed on this perfect sweet spot where combat is taking a good amount of time. Like, it's not dragging the night on, and yet it feels like every turn matters. If the enemy's taking a turn, that matters. And you want to kill that enemy before they take their turn if you can. If I'm taking my turn, I'm doing something. It's really rare, unless you're very, very unlucky with all your dice rolls, for your turn to be whiffed. Very often you have a lot of options to really make a difference in the combat. And I think that's where all of that iteration and tweaks to your balancing come to light.
Yeah, and we're going to, as we get our testing back with each iteration, we're going to get closer and closer to an experience that is good, not just on paper, but also feeling good to play testers and players. So I look forward to those rounds of iteration. It's going to be really, really helpful for getting the experience where we want it to be.
Cool. Then look, let's swing back to Brian and ask more narrative stuff, because one of the questions here is, there's 2 questions. I'm going to kind of spin them together. One is, how long is the campaign? So how many scenarios does the Atlas contain in terms of pages? And they ask, these guys actually also ask, will there be any mechanisms for random encounters?
So the number of locations that you'll play in a campaign will vary depending on the choices that you make. There will be some campaigns that are 18 to 20 locations long, and some that are 13 to 15. But that sweet spot is generally in like the sort of 15 to 18 location range.
Which is give or take about 20 to 25 hours of gameplay, I guess, depending on your bosses.
Yeah. And we sort of decided on that number for a couple of different reasons. We wanted to make sure that you were leveling up and getting new content at a decent clip, that you were having time to, feel comfortable in your character builds and things like that as far as combat goes. But then also narratively, this is sort of how long it took us to tell the stories that we wanted to tell. And I think that there is, I think that we have sort of done some interesting things when it comes to taking one path over another path. We've given players some, I think, some pretty cool choices for why they would take one path over another. That's a thing that we've been refining relatively recently. Is why would players go to the beach over going to Fort Joy? And that was a problem that has existed for a little while now, and I think we've sort of cracked the case on how to explain to players and how to give them rewards and how to sort of signpost where things are going, as far as that stuff goes.
Yeah, we have an
And I,
interesting challenge in the amount of endings we have, right? And how to signpost those endings well enough that the players can pursue the outcomes they're interested in, and
right.
without necessarily saying, here's your road, just go on it. We also have to be, there's a balance between how cryptic we are with also how communicative we are.
Yeah. And honestly, I think that we've done a very good job of to use the sort of traveler analogy of putting up signposts and then letting you ignore them if you want to.
Yeah.
One of the other things that was a method of consideration for those of you who are thinking 25 hours, that's not enough time. We actually wanted to make sure the game didn't go too long so that the replayability that we're building into this system actually matters.
Yep.
There are a lot of games out there that, flaunt, oh, this game is extremely replayable, but it's, 45 hours of a board game and you have to get everyone together in order to complete it just once. And then, it's technically replayable and then not practically replayable. So we wanted to actually have an experience where you could sit down and potentially play this game a couple different times and have a wildly different experience in each of these cases to actually see more of the content instead of have it only be hypothetical for you.
Yeah. I mean, I think to give out some numbers for a second, I'm not sure, Brian, if you mentioned it before, but there are 51 locations in the location book. You're expected, like Brian said, to encounter maybe 18 of those on average. I think we're on 16 bosses, 17 bosses. The number keeps escaping me.
That sounds about right. It's about that
It's
amount.
15 plus. Yeah, I think we're on 17. But there's 17 bosses, and you're only going to encounter about 4 of those in your adventures. So, in terms of replayability, in terms of not even replayability, because quite frankly, you see the boxes behind me. You guys have the same problem with the collections you have. Honestly, you just want a genuine experience, a real adventure that you can experience, play with your friends. Maybe you get lucky where, oh yeah, we can get another group of friends together, or those same group want to play again. And if we've made a game that connects with you that much, we're delighted. But what I'm so excited about, it's not about the replayability, it's about the variability. When I finish this game, my experience should be and will be very, very different to yours if you play with a completely different, based on not just the decisions that you make, the bosses you encounter, the paths you go down, the endings you can have,
Treasure you find.
the treasure you find. It will also change based on the builds you have, because you've got, like a dozen skill schools and 10 origins and all the uniqueness that comes in that. The amount of multiplication possibilities of different experiences is actually quite high, to the point where those experiences should feel very, very personal to you as a player.
Right. And I do want to take a second to talk about, and I'm not sure if we're going to get to this later, so this may just be a new thing. Um, Whenever we're talking about new builds and new skills and things like that, those things change the gameplay in a very obvious way. Throwing a fireball in combat is going to feel different than freezing someone. But we're also making sure that that feels different in the story. Having different skills qualitatively means that you'll do different things in the story. If you are a hydrosophist one game and then a pyrokinetic a different game, you will be able to do different things and take different paths and things like that. And I think that's really cool.
Yeah, actually, I didn't even mention the tag system or the way that works. Skills. Yeah, okay. Let's go back to the list because I feel like we've been going off script for a minute there. Which is totally fine. I think what's important is that we've a lot to say and a lot to talk about, and we can anything we don't cover, we will make sure to cover future updates. I guess there's definitely a big question, and I want to kind of address this from the get go on origin stories. Origin stories were obviously a stretch goal, and they were a stretch goal on the basis that there was going to be an individual storybook that would tie in with the storybook within the main game. Now, obviously, we're not doing the kind of pick your path storybook anymore. We're doing the integrated atlas like we are. So, how does the origins work with that now? I'll be real. The version we had a year and a half ago now, when we were testing it out and playing it, the origin stories were not necessarily delivering back then the way we wanted them to. They were much more private, I guess. And much like the storybook, when I got a personal origin moment, it was very well, first of all, it was private. I didn't share it with you. I read it privately. It could have taken 5 minutes or whatever to read it. It slowed the game down because it stopped while I was reading. And also, quite frankly, didn't really have any mechanical connection. It was just more kind of informing me who my character was and telling me, as opposed to me experiencing it and being that character, if that makes sense. So when we were coming to a certain degree, we brought everything back to the drawing board to figure out how we wanted to bring it forward with you guys. One of the things was, well, how do we do the story? How do we do the art? We're probably going to do a whole update, or at least part of an update with Kat on this specifically, because Brian, you know that Kat's been working heavily on the origins and specifically the Hall of Echoes, which we'll get into in that update. But I just want to say that the origins themselves, there is still obviously a unique mechanical benefit to picking each origin. We'll get into how the cards work later. We've actually got visuals we can show. But from a story perspective, the main thing I think we wanted to achieve with that was that there was a personal feeling of ownership on that story, and a personal decision or decisions that I could make that then impacted the story in a positive or negative way based on what I did as person, as Losa, as If, and as Sabille. And while we have changed it from the storybook specifically of, I'm in Lower Beach and I get a little tag that says Sabille on it, and then I'm in Fort Joy later and it does this. We have changed it from that to a more specific moment in the story, but there, if anything, the choices are much heavier, much more impactful, and not just have it meaning to me because I'm making active decisions in the story with that character rather than just kind of being informed about the character. It also has mechanical and some very heavy implications on the ending as well. I know that we don't necessarily want to talk too deeply, Brian, but do you want to get into that a little bit with me?
Yeah. I'll avoid talking about it specifically and sort of more talk about the feeling that we wanted going into this, because this was very much a situation where we started talking about it and we had a lot of really, really cool ideas, and then we had to figure out sort of how to make them work.
Yeah.
And I think that what we ended up with is very cool. Because it was one of those moments where we all looked at each other and we were like, what if we did something weird and different? And then, and then we sort of, corralled it into something that made sense and was playable and usable and all that sort of stuff.
We did something practical.
Yeah. But the feeling that we wanted to go with for the sort of story moments that you had for you as a character, the goals that we had up top was we wanted to make sure that you had a choice for the type of character that you wanted to play, and that is a thing that was sort of paramount up at the beginning. And it really comes full circle once you get into the Hall of Echoes. You will get to make choices about the type of character you are. We wanted to make sure that it felt personal, that you were making those choices for a reason, and that what Kat has been working on for a little bit. and then we also wanted it to be surprising. So, there will be a point in the story where you have to sort of look at the other people who are sitting around the table with you and judge whether or not you think that they're good adventuring companions. And we wanted players to be able to have a moment where they could gain new information and be like, oh,
That's who you are.
that's who you are.
Yeah,
that's different than what I thought, right? And we really wanted players to be able to have that moment, and I think sort of the execution of what we're getting out of that is pretty cool.
And again, part of what we had before was some of that, but it was just kind of more experiential. Now we've also wrapped it up into the story much tighter. We've wrapped it up into mechanics because per Noah has had to expand the repertoire of source skills, because you will gain source skills at certain points in the story, and some of them vary based on decisions that you make. And we've also then wrapped them into the endings themselves. I'm so hesitant to talk about the cool stuff that happens at the end, but also it's important. But needless to say, the personal origin story choices that you make genuinely do impact how your end plot in Act 3 specifically will unfold, play out. All right, well, that's enough before I actually go and spoil something. So let's talk about another question. That was the origin stories. Looking at the list. So one of the one of the questions that I've seen here is just about the inserts, the broken token insert, and the Wormwood board that we mentioned. There was genuine conversations within Larian and also with Wormwood directly about doing alternatives for that. We actually had a really good call with one of their team, just kind of spitballing some ideas of what we could do to do something really cool and premium. But the long and the short of it was, it's our heart and theirs that we would uphold the idea of this central piece. And while we could have done some cool stuff around the sideboard and player boards, we decided that, look, we'll leave it here rather than having to figure out if people want refunds or not. We're just going to refund everyone. So that refunding process will happen when we're over the coming months. It's something that our finance team will be working with, working on it as alongside with CrowdOxa and Kickstarter to make sure that we can get those refunds to you. Likewise, the broken token insert. Our goal was always to give you a premium insert on the basis that the insert we were originally going to provide probably wasn't necessarily as robust as it's going to be now. Our goal has been basically to say the insert we're going to make is going to be as good as we can make it, to the point where you probably don't want to replace it. The idea of the white box now is that not only does it shape up the cards in acts and in ways that you can digest it easily, but we're also digesting the game in two forms, so that you open the game and you can just take out the top half, and that's the tutorial, and you don't need to worry about the intimidating 4 kgs of cards at the bottom. You can just dive into the tutorial and play, and then start opening things as you go. So we're doing our absolute best to actually make that box experience as premium as possible, to the point where we're expecting you not really wanting an insert, but obviously I'm sure there will be others that will provide inserts online, but we're not going to be doing that on this campaign anymore, which is why the refunds will be. Getting back into gameplay, Noah, we dove into initiative a little bit in our conversation. One of the questions here is, will there be initiative opportunities? Will fast enemies always go first? Do you want to explain about the gameplay around that and any sort of tweaks or changes that players can interact with?
Yeah, so I mentioned this in the last time that we spoke, but one of the realizations that we came to rather early on in our experiences was that having little portraits that kind of tick down to show who's going next don't actually end up mattering significantly until you have some of them showing up more than others. At that point, you start to really get this interplay, but until then, the extent of what the interaction is, these two characters have switched in the lineup this time, and that can matter, but often it doesn't matter enough to justify the amount of bookkeeping that is necessary to keep it running smoothly. So what we instead did was there are fast enemies, there are slow enemies, and there's you in the middle as a team. I believe there are 1 or 2 skills that can adjust things in the middle of combat, but the largest interaction point that you're going to see on these is that a number of encounters that you have, if you approach them from one direction, the enemies will be fast, and if you approach them from another direction, the enemies will be slow. And if you remember, we talked about how combat only lasts 2 or 3 turns. It's because every single one of those turns that an enemy has is impactful to the point of, it's a matter of whether or not everyone survives or not. And so having the enemies taking an extra turn is a real cost to consider. So the largest point of interaction that you're going to find is that a number of scenarios, combat is going to begin one way or the other, but if you have an extra turn to prepare, that puts you at a significant advantage. So that's probably the largest interaction opportunity when it comes to initiative, I would say.
Cool. I actually have a follow up for that on a chat question, but let me quickly deal with one of the quick ones that's come in. Resetting the game will be a nightmare, I guess. It was commented. I'll actually say I don't think that's going to be true, because in reality, the way we're structuring our card boxes, it will be very handily in Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. The minions that you use will go back in there when you're done with them. The location deck that you use will go back in there when you're done with them. So you'll be kind of packing as you go. The only kind of complication in cleaning up for a new campaign will be your characters, which again will go into the skills or the items. So,
and the card backs are all different,
which will have dividers. So it should actually be fairly straightforward to clean up your game once you're kind of
right, because we don't have any sort of randomness in the deck of skills. Like it's not a deck builder or something like that where you have to sort by some little symbol that's hidden on the face. The back of these cards are all remarkably different from each other. So when it comes to putting everything back at the end, it's a matter of flipping over all of your cards, and you can sort them really quickly.
Yeah. So to go back to mechanics and the gameplay that we were just discussing, apologies, where you're talking about initiative, I kind of wanted to, again, dive into combat a little bit more, because one of the questions, if I can find it, was what about barrels? And somebody in the chat has just asked, well, what about will we be getting a chart on the status effects like that was shown in the video from the before when we showed the old chart? So I guess what I would like to talk about, one is, sadly, the barrels will not be making it, but the core heart and reason for that is because of the way we've completely redesigned the elemental system. So I guess to go over it and also to explain why there won't be a chart, can you just explain the thought processes of the way we've been going with our skill system, but also then what we're doing with the barrels as well?
Yes. So in the previous system, there were a intimidating number of statuses that could be applied to either locations or to characters, depending on where they're aimed or what the specifics of the ability was. In addition to that, all of those interacted. So if you were attaching hot to wet, then you could now get steamy.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a large amount of mental overhead that players had to keep track of, and that necessitated the use of a chart. Adding to that, you had barrels, which could explode during the course of an effect that would then require you to kind of get a hold of when does this barrel explode during the course of this ability, and oh, it applied this status effect to the area, but then it blew up this barrel. Now we have to worry about how that status effect that the barrel is applying. There was a lot of overhead that often boiled down to everyone takes an extra point of damage, and then the status effect that it applied immediately disappears because it was overwritten by something else, or it would be something like, "Oh, you died," and neither of those are necessarily a satisfactory ending to what is essentially a little homework assignment.
Yeah.
The changes that we made to that whole system now drastically simplify the implementation, but not the interaction. So you now have status effects that can affect characters. You have area conditions that can affect areas, and they stack freely with each other. The statuses that you have on your person, they stick with you as you go from area to area, and the area conditions that apply to an area apply to that area and anyone who's in it, and they don't go with you. The ones that apply to areas are really simple. They are just a damage increase for specific types of damage. The interesting thing is that there are a pretty large number of skills that care about what the condition of the area that you're targeting is specifically. So if you are, there are a number of Aeromancer attacks, Aerotheur's attacks that care if the area is wet. Now they inherently care if it's charged, but there are a number that also do something interesting if it is wet, which makes sense. You use a lightning bolt on a wet area, and that increases the damage of the area, and then now the area has become charged.
Yeah.
So we moved the interaction and the chart memorization to the skills themselves, where if there is some sort of collision between status effects or between area conditions or between skills and any of those, that's spelled out on the skill itself. So we basically took that chart, chopped it into a bunch of pieces, and took the most interesting parts and put them onto skills themselves. So those interactions still exist, but they're spelled out for you, and you don't have to memorize or cross-reference or use a lookup table to enjoy those interactions.
Which goes back to your sentiment in the update, where we're doing our best to give information in the player's hand. So your information is on the card. It tells you specifically, you do this, but also if you can make the area wet or oily or charged or whatever, it also does this cool effect, which then immediately incentivizes you to go, well, how do I do that? I want to make
exactly.
And I think if I can also say from a meta level, we obviously had a huge amount of skills to play with at the beginning. It's not like you have reduced the skills in the game. If anything, I think you might have even added a few. But the reality is that the interactions that each of those skills have, if anything, they are more satisfying because they're clearer to the player and easier to understand and easier to interpret and know when I can do them in. So we haven't reduced the skills in the game. We haven't reduced the interactivity. We've just changed how it's interpreted and how it's read.
Rather than you having to consult the manual to determine whether or not there was an interesting interaction going on, you know that there's going to be an interesting interaction, provided you can meet these conditions that we spell out on the card. Mm-hmm. Which, as far as our testing has shown so far, is still very satisfying without requiring a lot of overhead and memorization of or consulting of a rather impressive looking but intimidating chart.
Brian, we're going to spin it back to you because chat has questions.
Oh, I'm in.
So chat has been asking a bunch of questions about story.
Ominous.
So, they've got lots of ominous questions, but we're avoiding those once we're going into the story. So story is specifically, there's a few, so let me read out a few so you get the sense of what
yeah.
Is the story the same as the DOS 2 story, or is it a new story? What is the overall scope of the story? How many acts are in the game? Does this add anything to the character lore, the overall story for people that coming from the video game? And then basically, is this the story of DOS 2 going from the Fort Joy all the way into Reaper's Coast, etc., etc.? So I guess obviously there's some differences. So do you want to explain a little bit about what we're doing, how it differs from DOS 2?
So we're taking a lot of the groundwork that DOS 2 laid as far as the story goes. And Kieran and Larian in general has given us a tremendous amount of freedom to sort of tell a story that melds with the board game and with the way that we're doing things, which means that story is necessarily and fundamentally a little bit different than the DOS 2 video game. There's going to be a lot of recognizable pieces from DOS 2 if you've played the video game before. There will be characters that you run into that you will recognize, like we talked about Sir Laura. They may be more or less important, depending on how we feel about them, right? Sir Laura is the most important character in the game.
Yeah, don't worry. He's important, but not that.
Yeah. But yeah, so we're sort of I think the easiest way to explain it is that we're dealing with sort of an alternate universe version of DOS 2, where there are a lot of the same characters, a lot of the same locations, but they change and react differently. There are some new characters that we have introduced in order to sort of flesh out different areas and different locations, and so we're very excited for you to meet those people and interact with some of them. Some of them are very nice to you, some of them are not. And we're really excited to let y'all interact with that. Right now, we have the story split up into 3 acts. Each act is somewhere between 4 and 6 locations each, which is and 2 levels. Yeah. So you'll do level 1 and 2 in Act 1, levels 3 and 4 in Act 2, and levels 5 and 6 in Act 3. And then you'll get to an ending, and the endings are wildly different from one another. And you might even get you might get an ending that is wildly different from someone who took the same path.
You could do the same ending, and it'd be different based on
have it be different.
the choices you made in previous locations.
Correct. So we're pretty excited about that, and we're excited to let people see sort of what we've done, and sort of how we've changed things up.
I guess, can I like from the Larian perspective, from the IP perspective, while the differences are there, the heart is there as well, right? So like, while we've taken some liberties in certain things happening, we also have a bunch of new characters, and I had a really interesting conversation with Jan, who was basically the lead writer for DOS 2. For DOS 1 has literally with Larian a lot longer than I have, and for a long time, and he was actually excited by the prospect of what the board game allows us to do for Fort Joy and for the area around it, because it actually allows us to flesh out that area in a different, show it from a different perspective, a different angle. So I think the easiest kind of answer is, yeah, it's a multi-act structure. There's very much a beginning, middle, and end. There's a design in the story for that, but also we have created an experience that if you're familiar with DOS 2, it's going to feel like home, but it's also going to feel different. Like you just exactly, and that should give you a unique twist on your experience as well. All right, Noah. I have a cramp in my foot, so that's why I'm wiggling a bit.
I can't help with that.
Yeah, I know. It's like, please go away. Can you discuss and present how crafting equipment will be implemented as well as its extent? So basically, merchant, crafting, consumables, a bunch of stuff has changed, so we can go into that as well.
Yes, I can. So the equipment that you're going to encounter in this game is largely filling the same set of functions that equipment the gaming world over serves. Armor that you find is going to increase your survivability. Weapons that you find is going to increase your offense, and then trinkets and such will increase the amount of utility that you have when you're trying to go after certain builds. The biggest change that you're going to notice in terms of the equipment is going to be how you can get it, because the merchant system has changed. Rather than merchants randomly or semi-randomly popping up in the middle of a location, you're going to be presented with the opportunity to purchase and sell your items at semi-regular intervals. That will allow you to kind of over the course of the game pursue the build of equipment that you're trying to get that meshes with your character. In terms of crafting, I have some bad news and some good news. The raw system of taking crafting materials and turning them into consumables or other usable goods is not staying. There is no specific crafting system of, I'm going to take this item and this piece of loot and this piece of loot, mix them together and get this piece of usable cardboard. However, we did move towards, you can still acquire consumables,
Yeah.
We're kind of skipping the crafting step and instead going directly to the consumables. One of the things that we had noticed while playtesting was that we really didn't like when you had like just an absolute wealth of crafting materials that all produced things you didn't want, or didn't produce anything, and it getting rewarded with your fifth piece of crocodile tooth that you didn't need feels like not even a reward at all.
Yeah, or
It's
you had the ingredients to make stuff that you really didn't need or want or
yeah, that you really
synergize
didn't
with.
need. So you're getting these rewards that you'd almost rather not get something than get this stuff that's completely useless. So we move towards guaranteeing you a consumable instead. You get this. And our initial tests showed that there was still a bit of frustration that was coming up. Where, if you're building an archer character and you're never drawing any arrows, well, great. You get to fire basic arrows for the rest of the game. And every once in a while, you get one frost arrow that you get to fire and hope that you don't lose after the fight. And that was also frustrating. So we did further subdivide it down, and now there are 4 classes of consumable that you have the potential to get. So when you're at a merchant or trying to do what I'm going to call like narrative crafting, in that you succeed on a skill check and get something as a result, we subdivided that out so that if you are an archer character, you can keep opting into, I would like to get arrows, please, and that'll help you keep you flush, so that when you're interacting with the combat system and firing arrows at things, they're not always the basic arrow that is kind of intrinsic to the item, and instead you can have interesting effects attached to your consumables, or you have projectiles, or you have scrolls, or you have potions. So you get to kind of poke around in there and get the thing you want. So there's no specific tailor-made crafting system of I've got these ingredients and I'm making the thing I want. And that's not actually the thing that we're losing, because the initial system didn't do that to player satisfaction anyway.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that when we were discussing the system, it part of the last 6 months, like I mentioned before, this is one of those things that we have rigorously tested. And a lot of the time, the old system, while it was cool when it worked, a lot of the time it wasn't, can I do
Fantastic problem.
this? Yeah, it wasn't, it was promised and it was exciting and we really wanted to make it work, but it wasn't something that deliberately actually allowed the player much agency in their decision. It was still you drawing a random card, whether we like it or not. And then when we simplified it to that point and we just gave you a consumables deck, that was too random, because then you still were just drawing random stuff. So that's why we split it into the 4 decks, which quite frankly came from testing. It came from that experiential, what do our players want when they play.
Right. So ultimately, you will still be able to acquire consumables that uniquely supplement your kit. It's just the system you will go about implementing to acquire them is going to be a little different.
Cool. Then yeah, look, let's keep going here. We're getting to the end of our questions, but that is also filling up very quickly with extra questions from chat. So we're gonna go at least for another 20 minutes, maybe a bit longer, depending on where we are with our questions. Brian, one of the main questions that came up, gameplay related, I think in Kickstarter, was in the previous design we placed cards on the board to explore. Are we still placing cards on the atlas to explore and discover the text below? If not, how does exploration actually work right now? Because while we kind of showed it a little bit visually, we didn't necessarily explain how it works, and also how we haven't lost any of the coolness of placing cards down. Do you want to explain how that was working now?
Yeah. So the short answer is yes. You will still be placing some cards on the Divine Atlas whenever you find a secret passage or open a locked door or do something like that. There is still discoverability in there. The thing that we did is we sort of preempted placing all of the cards that you would have been placing anyway. So now, instead of placing out 6 cards and then you'll find cards 7 and 8 as you explore, we just print those cards on the board.
And you can
And
still find 7 and 8.
yeah, and you can still go and you can find 7 and 8. So, if I am in the Magister's quarters and I am trying to, unlock a locked door, I might make a skill check to pick the lock or have found a key or whatever. And then, when I unlock that door, it'll tell me, hey, take a card out of the location deck, place it down on the Divine Atlas. Now you can go explore that area, and you can explore that in future things. So we still do get some of that coolness, and we do it in a bunch of different ways over the course of the game. There are areas that
More
are
extreme than others.
yeah, some are more extreme than others. There are areas that when you open them up, they're largely blank, and you have to try and find out, what's going on around here. There's some where there are areas that are behind locked paths, and you have to figure out, hey, I can see that place, but I don't know how to get to it. And you have to explore to figure out how to do that. And sometimes it's fighting, sometimes it's skill checks, sometimes it's solving puzzles. But it's all just sort of tools that we have in our toolbox in order to make those locations exciting and interesting.
What I like about it as well is it allows us to do a few things like the double-sided nature of these cards also actually introduced.
Right.
Because we can have information that's, you might not have the tag or the rep prerequisite, or you might just say, I'm not going to risk that challenge, whatever. Therefore, I'll leave it, won't discover the flip side of it, and allow somebody else to explore it. So it actually gives us more nuance in how the party interacts with it. And it has the added benefit that as you're exploring, you're not losing the artwork, because as you flip those cards over and they were explored, it gradually became you playing on just white paper and text as opposed to the actual artwork that was immersing you in the
The Kieran mentioned it quickly, but in the previous system, if you encountered a locked door and didn't have the key or someone who was capable of unlocking it, that was what happened. And oops, too bad. Under this system, having some of the cards be printed and some of the cards be discoverable and placeable, we now have the ability to allow you to hang on to that the knowledge of the existence of that locked door, and then return to it in a future exploration round with someone who has the key or someone who knows how to pick locks, and adds a little extra layer of interactability with the environment that didn't previously exist.
Yeah, for sure. I got a question from chat, which is making me think we need to go into the next part, which is basically the origins and character creation. So the question specifically was, will you be discouraged from pursuing certain builds based on the character you play? I think there was some confusion as well, because one or two of the questions we got seemed to indicate, oh, if I pick Beast, I'm definitely a Hydra Fist, or I'm definitely this or that. No, I guess, do you want to start? I know this a topic all three of us can talk about. But one of the other questions we had before was, I love the complete freedom from DOS 1 and 2 with my character creator. Is this new system giving me a hard nudge in a certain direction? And basically, the concern is, if I want to play a certain build, am I forced to pick a specific origin? Can you explain a little bit about our origins and what they actually look like?
So each origin has, I'm going to do a quick overview first. Each origin has 3 cards that are all double-sided that represent the 6 levels that you can possess. I think we had a question about why we chose to do it that way. And that was so that, yes, we could have fit all of that information on a lookup table on one side of one card. But as we've kind of mentioned as our philosophy, we want the information that is relevant to you, easy to hand, and the information that is not relevant, tucked away where you can get it if you need it, but you don't need to worry about it cluttering up your space. So we went with 3 cards. Each has exactly what you should be having in terms of health, source, talents, etc. at any given level. And each origin has a unique ability, but that unique ability is not something like your pyromancer skills do extra damage. It is instead something that interacts with a broad number of skills. Some of them are going to be more relevant for some stuff than others. There are a couple characters that are a little bit more proficient with 2-handed weapons than with 1-handed weapons. But they just don't mandate that 2-handed weapon is a sword. It could be a staff, and now you're a 2-handed caster and you're proficient in that way.
Or it gives you flexibility of having a ranged and a melee weapon.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What the Origins do is they don't mandate a play style. They give you a twist on whatever it is you wanted to do anyway. And leveling up and building your character is actually, I think, has more freedom than in the previous system. In the previous system, when you wanted to build someone who was a necromancer and a pyromancer, you needed to go increase your training in necromancy and pyromancy. And then around the middle of the game, if you decided, oh, you know what, we really need some healing, and you take a little dip into Hydrosophist so that you can take a healing skill, it's going to underperform because you don't have any training in that skill. And what we changed in this was that instead there's now just a star system that represents how good certain skills are for you. There are a number of skills that offer flat effects, and there are a number of skills that offer a scaling effect based on essentially your level because they scale with your star bonus. And what that allows you to do is take a mid game or late game dip into a utility effect from another school and not have it not deliver on the promise that the skill is making because you didn't train hard enough for that skill. So we drastically simplified the prerequisites and the how efficient certain skills are to increase the number of viable builds. It's very possible for you to do a warfare and two-handed skill tree and go hard into that, and then dip into pyromancy because you want a couple range attacks, that sort of thing. Whereas in a previous build, that might not have been something that was uh, not that it was impossible, but it would underperform. And in this case, skills that scale with the stars allow you to do that and have it be meaningful, and still be a viable or even really interesting, depending on your equipment or runes, build.
Yeah, and I think it's right now, just so everybody knows what we're talking about. Um, the way that you sort of build a character and advance a character over the course of the game is, whenever you level up, you get a skill. You might get some star bonuses. You'll get some extra health, and all of that stuff is laid out for you. Whenever you level up. So as you advance through the game, you're going to be getting more skills and more talents over the course of the game. Some talents require you to be a certain level, and then the only things that you have to worry about whenever you're choosing a skill is that the skill is your level or lower, and then if the skill is an advanced skill, that you're trained. So as soon as which are talents. So as soon as I become trained in necromancy, I'm the party's trained necromancer. I can take, level 3, 4, and 5 necromancy skills. And Kieran, if Kieran decides that he wants to be a huntsman, he can take huntsman training and then take all of the cool advanced huntsman skills. And that allows us to sort of really sort of hone in on, if you want to specialize, here's how you do it. You take a talent and you go. If you want to be a jack of all trades, just pick whichever skills sort of fit your needs at the moment.
Right. When it comes to building deep instead of building broad, and the advantage to that is that you have a number of skills that self-synergize within a school. So you have a skill that can make the area warm. You have a skill that can set someone on fire, and then you have a skill that does fire damage. Well, those are all in the pyromancy school, and they're going to interact favorably with each other in terms of damage synergies. But if you wanted to do broad instead, you can still get the utility spells and the star bonus scaling spells and still have a meaningful interaction and feel like you're contributing in combat and out of combat, etc.
Yeah, I think what I like about this though is that we still we still reward people for specializing, but we now enable people to spread out more if they so wish. And while the promise was there in our previous system of spreading out, taking utility, it was only for utility, because other than the effect, it wasn't really full. It wasn't really necessarily pulling its weight in usefulness. So what we've essentially done is make more builds viable, as you say. You can still have a very specialized card, still have a very team focused in different builds and different people doing different team, while without necessarily essentially having restrictions. And also, quite frankly, if you realize halfway through the game that, hey, my build, it would be cool if I, you know, splashed in necromancy and nobody else has done any necromancy. Oh wait, those spells are really cool. You don't necessarily need to respec your character, which is something that we allow in the game. You could just simply go, I'm going to take the necromancy talent and I'm going to suddenly become very talented in necromancy and start diverging in that. And then some, you know, before you know it, your character has evolved again, not just because you've decided what build to do, but through play you've gone, I kind of want to do this, and we kind of unlock that, and you don't get punished for not making those decisions earlier in the game.
Right.
Sweet. Then I guess if I could also, I had visuals up for a second, but one of the confusing things we had was, well, why is there 3 cards? We want to. I don't think we actually talked about that in the last in that. So do we want to just talk about those 3? Did we?
Noah touched on it, but I think like just to sort of spell it out is whenever you're a level 1 character, you have your character's level 1 card in front of you. So Beast level 1 or Red Prince level 1, sort of like you're showing right here, is a card that's in front of you. And then when you level up, you'll change that card. So now you have Red Prince's level 2 card. And then when you level up again, you'll get Red Prince's level 3 card. And that sort of fell out of, we wanted to take away the pens and the paper from the table so that you no longer have to, you know, mark down, you know, this is what I chose when I level up. That's all this sort of stuff. We implemented a lot of that stuff in different ways through talents and skills and items and equipment. That's how you change and modify your character. Leveling up is you get some bonuses, you get to make a couple of choices, but we sort of know what your stats are whenever that sort of thing happens, which sounds like a much bigger change than it actually is, because while you got to make a couple of decisions when you leveled up in the previous system about like, oh, do I want, you know, health here or a little bit more source or things like that, all of the characters largely ended up with the same stats with minor variations. And, you know, I think we wanted to make sure that players were making less decisions that were much more impactful whenever they were leveling up. And that's sort of why we made those decisions and went that way.
Cool. I'm just conscious that our time is ticking, so I'm going to say it here before we... if there's any questions lingering in the chat, please do post them now. We'll keep an eye on it for the last 10 minutes. One thing to keep in mind is that I'm seeing questions we've already addressed. For those who have missed the beginning, or if you didn't realize that we addressed it, to make sure we're clear in what we're saying, we'll be posting this VOD and also a summary of everything that's been explained in another update coming soon. So if you've missed something or if something isn't clear, we'll try and break it down even further in the update. So looking at some of the questions from chat and also ones that we've missed, I think we've dealt with most of the questions from our pre questions. Am I right, guys? Is there anything that that's lingering that I've missed? I think we've dealt with star systems.
Yeah, I think we got to most of it. I think we got to all of it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh, nightmare mode. Lots of questions about nightmare mode. Nightmare mode is going to be there. It's one of those things that we'll be putting in there again once we've kind of balanced the core experience, but it'll be put into the testing like everything else. A little bit like the dungeon. In fact, when we package it, it'll probably be packaged something like Nightmare Dungeon, and cards that explain how to run the dungeon, but also then how to run the nightmare mode. Lads and lassies, please play normal mode at the beginning when you experience this game. It's already fairly lethal. Nightmare mode is, it's not like it's not like tactician mode in DOS 2 where, oh, I know DOS games, I could just do tactician mode. No, nightmare mode is going to seriously hurt. So highly recommend you play the already hard-hitting version of the game that we're... It's playable and it's beatable, but it's definitely hard hitting already, so be careful.
The base game enemies are calibrated so that the plan is not everyone's going to survive every fight. Victory is not assured. So nightmare mode does that harder.
Yeah, nightmare mode is definitely we're gonna try and kill you.
Yeah, we are actively going to be pursuing player death in majority of cases for nightmare mode.
And can I just say, as I work on some of these locations with Brian, very often I'm like, you just want to kill the player, don't you? So he's already that way inclined, just to keep that in mind. A couple more questions. What was that? You going to say something?
Brian's a TPK DM.
Yeah, Brian, I don't know if I ever want to play D&D with you. I'm just going to say it out loud for everybody in the chat to know. What was I going to say? How does the game deal with dying? I guess I could just answer this quickly, but essentially death is possible. We have resurrection scrolls. There's ways of resurrecting your party members outside of that as well. If everyone dies, sometimes it's a TPK where you have to restart the location or whatever, or you end if you're playing in a kind of a honor mode. But in reality, we actually have contingencies for loss, right, Brian?
Right. Every fight that you get into will have sort of win text and lose text. If you win, this happens. If you lose, this happens. And like you said, the loss text runs the gamut from you get away but just barely, and you sort of have some reduced health for the location. Sometimes you lose items, sometimes you lose all your gold, all the way up to, hey, sorry, your adventure is over. You can restart the location, or if you are playing in Iron Man mode, restart the whole campaign.
Yes, please. Iron Man mode is also possibly for your second campaign.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to fly through some of these questions, but chime in, lads, if there's something that I'm saying that you disagree with, because God knows there's probably something I'll get wrong. Slain miniature. Slain is still in the game. The mini will still be included. In terms of Slain, he's actually a fightable boss, but also potentially recruitable. Not saying much more than that, but
depending on the choices you make.
Choices you make. What? So the side boxes we've already discussed, Elder. Essentially, they are still in the game. We'll be talking about them in the future update. Everything that we've said in this, like I said, will be included in detail in a future update. So if you've missed something in this chat, that's okay. Resurrection. Oh, sorry about this. And you have more than 4 players. The game is currently a 2 to 4 player experience. No doubt you could possibly mod it yourself to do so, but keep in mind that the combats are going to be balanced around 2 to 4 players. And then
you can also play solo. You just control 2 people.
Yes, you're controlling 2 people. Anything else? Anything you guys think that we should probably mention or say at this point?
I saw one question skate by a little while ago. The skills are still going to use the same cooldown system, largely speaking, that they previously did. There are a number of skills that are ongoing, so they will be played face. When you play them, they'll go face up in your cooldown track, and then when their effect expires, which might be before they come off cooldown, you'll just flip them face down to let you know that they're no longer applying. All other skills, you do what it says on the card, and then put it in your cooldown face down in the appropriate spot. And then on each of your turns, they'll slide to the left. Anything that falls off your cooldown board, you get back your hand. You can use it again.
If anything, we're using the cooldown track even more because we're using it with status effects as well.
Status effects will also go up there when you are inflicted a status by enemy. It's going to sit down there. It's going to sit in your cooldown track. It's going to do stuff. And when it falls off, that status will wear off as well.
There is a question about runes.
Yeah.
Runes. Runes are things that you will get as rewards for doing various things, whether that's, again, fights, puzzles, talking to people, and
they will noticeably change your experience.
Yes, they will pretty noticeably change your experience, depending on the ones that you get. Basically, they each have every runestone has a couple of sides to it, and it says that they can get attached to specific types of equipment, whether that's rings or your helmet or your armor or your weapons or whatever. and they'll add an effect to that thing. And sometimes
that effect could be as small as you take 1 less water damage to as large as once per foe per turn. If it tries to attack you, you can re-roll the targeting die.
I'm going to show that right now because somebody asked, can we show more visuals? So this is the small frost rune, I believe, which essentially take 1 less water damage. And the flip side of that, because you can decide to use it as an armor buff, that's why it has the armor symbol left.
The side will attach to your armor slot.
And the other side is actually a ring slot, so trinket that you gain an action point if you start your turn in the wet area. And this is obviously a lower strength rune. You have very powerful ones as well.
Each rune can attach to one of those slots. Each slot can have one thing attached to it. So if you end up with too many armor slot runes, you're going to have to spread those out among you and pick the ones that are most interesting to you in particular. But we hand these out pretty regularly. Not for free. You got to do stuff. But the opportunities are there, and some of them can completely shift your build if you get them. You can do some pretty silly stuff in the later stronger runes.
I had a good question there actually about a hard time understanding how cooldown will basically work if the fight ends early. So I mean, they just stay in your cooldown, right? They tick down every turn. Again, one of the changes from the existing system is that time doesn't pause anymore. Time keeps ticking. So every turn, whether in combat or exploration, cooldowns are ticking.
Right, and that's relevant because most locations have the opportunity for more than one combat, and they don't necessarily start at the same time. So you might escape from one combat and then be plunged immediately into another with half of your skills on cooldown. Well, that's going to be a much more difficult fight than if everything came back off. And you could choose have a couple exploration rounds and just kind of not explore and just chill and relax to get stuff off cooldown, but then your clock is ticking down and you might not even be able to finish that second fight because you run out of time.
Right. Yeah, it's I don't know if it's a thing that we talked about, but the locations are all sort of tuned and know how long you're taking to complete them. So if you take too long in a location, you might, get an extra fight or not be able to take the exit that you wanted to, or lose access to certain areas or things like that. Those are all things that we do on the location.
Or die.
Or die. Sometimes we just kill you.
Brian likes to kill people in games.
We mentioned that.
Yes, it's becoming a theme, so we should probably be careful. I'm not sure if there's anything necessarily jumping out that we haven't already discussed, but I guess the reality is this is the beginning of us really nailing down our design, really now balancing it and putting it through as robust testing as possible. There will be more updates where we'll be going over some of the bigger details. We've made some tweaks to bosses, for instance, which we haven't necessarily dove into. The core experience of each boss will feel different, it's still the same, but we've actually leaned in. We're excited to talk about that.
There are mini games galore.
Yes, we'll definitely talk to Kat about Hall of Echoes. We'll probably talk to one of our graphic designers about the visual changes that we've been making. So there's going to be a lot more happening over the coming months on how we discuss and how we on. Likewise, as we are testing with our full-time testers, we'll be talking about that and seeing what sort of getting from that. But no more 8 months of radio science. That I can guarantee. Other than that, though, I just want to say thank you for everyone who turned up. Thank you for your patience as we've gone through all these questions. There is a lot to discuss, no doubt. There's still going to be more questions after this. But once again, it's all about us trying to get that information to you. So be patient with us as we do, but we are best to get it to. Like I said, there'll be a summary of this with the VOD posted, so you'll be able to watch it back or just read the main points and what we have to say about them. Brian, Noah, anything you want to say to the backers or to anybody as we finish up?
Thanks for joining us. This was a lot of fun to talk about. I'm very excited for the way this game is going. Can't wait to see it on shelves.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Thanks for asking a lot of really good questions, and to the one or two people in the chat that said I had great hair, I appreciate it. You have great hair too.
What's wrong with my hair? Apart from that, it's a bit sweaty right now. No, he does have great hair. He's only one of us, I think, Noah, that could probably carry a mohawk is Brian. But yes, and I think Noah is probably very looking forward to start playing, giving out why this skill is underpowered and this one's overpowered, etc., etc.
Oh yes, there's a reason why we didn't show all the skills yet. It's because there's a lot of balancing to be done.
Some of them are definitely overtuned and not, and we know that we're already tweaking them, but we know that they'll get more fine tuned as we start seeing what. One thing we were already immediately aware after our 6 months of testing has been how much we already know the system too well. So we're looking forward to getting new minds and new puzzle solvers into it to figure out if there's other solutions or other possible abuses that we haven't been aware of the system.
And also just how quickly players can get a handle on the system. We want to make sure that that is a quick thing. We want you to be playing this game and enjoying it and not spend the first 6 sessions trying to remember how to play.
Yeah, 100%. So look, that's it. Thank you very much, and we'll end the stream there. Hopefully it won't be too long before the next time we talk to you, but before that, we'll bid you adieu and goodbye.
See ya.